I was only 11 years old when this took place, so a lot of time has passed since then, but I'll do my best to recall the details of what transpired. We were on vacation with our family, but technically it was a vacation with two families because the Gamas joined us. They had a daughter by the name of Beth who was roughly my age and a son by the name of Linda who was a baby. Both of us still had both of our parents in the picture at the time. Since my father was unable to take time off from work, it was up to me to watch over my mother and act as the head of the household while we were away. We had plans to visit Yellowstone National Park. I've never been there, despite the fact that it seems to be a stunning location, because of what took place there. We needed 2 cars because there were 6 of us, so we split up, my mother and I in one car, and the Gomez family in the other. It would have been loud and crowded, and when Beth and I were in the car together on a road trip, our parents could have expected at least 2 hours of the song that never ends and enough punch buggy to drive anyone crazy. We could have crammed into one if we had to, but it would have been noisy and uncomfortable. However, Beth and I had small radios that allowed us to communicate with one another. We arranged the rest stops and the food stops in advance. Because the trip was going to take us 2 days, we worried less on the first day because we knew we were going to have to stop for the night in a hotel regardless. But on the second day, we wanted to make sure that we were following each other closely so that when we got to Yellowstone, we could stop and sightsee together. For this reason, we made sure that we traveled in the same direction. We couldn't find them after the first half of the second day. Me and Beth had been on the radios, discussing the animals that we were going to see and which ones we thought would let us pet them. We had been talking about the radios. I can still hear Beth saying, "I'd like to pet a bear because I think they're adorable," in my head. Over. And because I didn't want to be the one to burst her bubble, even though I thought it was a potentially terrible idea, I suggested, "The buffaloes might be nicer. And they have a supple appearance." Over. My mother did not pop either of our illusions regarding that topic, even though I am certain that if we had attempted to do so, she would have gone completely insane. "Are you worried about having to spend the night in the woods?" Over. Beth inquired, and I distinctly recall walking past their car at the time that she was saying this. They were beginning to slow down, but I was unsure as to why. "No, camping isn't new to me. I've done it before. It's nothing to be afraid of." But I didn't say over just yet. As I watched them pull up even further behind us, my first thought was that perhaps they had a problem with one of their tires. It's also possible that Mr. Gomez had to go to the bathroom. However, I do recall that it was a particularly dense area of brush, and I was concerned about being attacked by animals. We were traveling on a less major road, and the trees on either side of the road were actually bending over and casting a shadow across it. I remember that up until the point where I became concerned about them, I hadn't even noticed that at all. "Why are you guys coming to a halt?" Over. "I'm not sure, but I think Dad is being silly." Then, at a heightened volume, "Dad?" I asked, "What the heck is going on?" In the background, I could make out Mrs. Gomez's voice, and it sounded as though she had just gotten out of bed. Because Beth was keeping her finger on the button until she had an answer for me, I was able to hear everything that was going on. "Dad." She began to speak, but then she stopped herself. Her voice regardless, but she did not let go of the button she was pressing. The conversation that took place after that is something that will remain in my memory forever. Because they were hidden from view, I was unable to observe anything that was taking place. As soon as the car door was opened, I was able to make out every word that Mrs. Gomez said. "Jared, what the heck are you doing? Jared? Do not venture out into that area." Then Beth spoke up, "Mommy, can you tell me what that is?" However, Mrs. Gomez was far too involved in whatever was going on outside to pay attention to what her daughter had to say. "Oh, my God. Oh God." She let out a yell. After that, I heard her scream, and then Beth asked, "Daddy?" Beth's finger was lifted off the button just as the sound of the car door creaking could be heard. After that, I had the bright idea to mention to my mother that there might be some problems. I tried to explain what had just taken place to her, but I don't think I was making much sense at the time. I begged and pleaded with my mother to make a U-turn so that I could see what was going on, but all she said was, "We're not going to do that, honey, but don't worry, they'll be okay." As an adult, I can now comprehend it. When I was a kid, cell phones weren't even a thought because we didn't have them yet. She made the decision to bring me to safety in the event that there was some kind of actual danger occurring. My memory of her is that she was noticeably tense but was making an effort to hide it. At the next rest stop, she pulled over and stopped the car. After Beth's car broke down, it seemed like we were driving for an interminable amount of time, but I actually have no idea how long it was. During the drive to her location, I made several attempts to radio her, but I was unable to reach her. I inquired with my mother as to whether or not we ought to get in touch with the authorities, but she responded by stating that she wanted to wait a while before doing so. When she thinks back on it now, it's likely that she just assumed Beth's parents were having a fight. It's likely that she didn't want to get involved in this. My mother reassured me that even if we became separated, the original plan had been to meet at the following rest stop, so they ought to be checking in even if we sat there with our car pulled into a spot facing the road and faced the road. For the sake of safety, I made a commitment to keep both of my eyes on the road at all times. However, as the minutes, and most likely the hours, passed, the hot afternoon sun beat down, and pretty soon I found myself falling asleep. When I opened my eyes, my mother was shaking me and acting excited in front of me. Even as a young child, I was able to see through their hypocrisy. "Look," she remarked, "they've returned." The sun was beginning to set as the van pulled up next to us at this point. My mother was tense, and looking back, I believe that it was because she was anticipating seeing Mrs. Gomez with a black eye or covering up some bruises. I don't remember if there were any signs of abuse with Beth's parents, or if Beth's mother had just latched onto what would have made sense. I don't remember. What I'd overheard on the radio could very well be construed as the beginning of a fight. I'd heard it over the radio. However, that is in no way what emerged from inside of that van. I believe that the fact that we did nothing was due to the fact that we were in a state of shock at the time. I really have no idea. I mean, what the hell are you supposed to do when you come across something that just doesn't appear to be able to be explained by the norms that govern our world? After the door on the driver's side opened, Mr. Gomez stepped out of the vehicle. I only knew it was him, or thought I knew it was him, due to the fact that he was significantly taller than both Mrs. Gomez and the children. On the other hand, he was wrapped in bandages from head to toe. He gave off the impression of a movie mummy or a character from a soap opera who was about to unveil an entirely new face. However, he was wearing something over his eyes that looked like a dark gauze or fabric rather than sunglasses. It was concealed beneath the white gauze that covered his face, giving the impression that he had two misshapen eyes that were completely black in color. The door to the passenger compartment opened, and the remaining members of the family exited the vehicle. Mrs. Gomez was seen holding Linda, and both she and Linda were attired in warm clothing. Beth stumbled out of the room, her bandages being especially messy. As soon as Mr. Gomez opened the door to our car, I had a shiver run up and down my spine. "Thank you very much, but I'll drive," he told my mother in that. Suddenly, I found myself laughing. There had to be a joke or an elaborate practical joke behind it. What other possible explanation could there have been? "Oh ha, you're right, that's very funny." My mother stated this, but she did not give off an amused vibe at all. I said I'll drive. Mr. Gomez repeated himself once more. "Thank you." After saying that, he reached out and grabbed my mother's arm. "Oh, all right, no problem." After getting out of the car, my mother pretended to be amused as she said to Mrs. Gomez, "I didn't know Jared was such a jokester." Mrs. Gomez did not reply, however, she did open the passenger door and grab my arm as she exited the vehicle. After taking a closer look at the bandages, I noticed that they were dirty, and I noticed that near the beginnings of her arms and legs, there was a very small amount of a brownish red fluid that was leaking through. Because I couldn't decide how I felt about that, I just got out of the car and walked away. As she took her seat, my mother and I exchanged glances before continuing. My mother put on a fake smile as we crammed ourselves into the trunk. Beth stumbled after her, just like everyone else. Her eyes appeared to have been covered up in the same manner. I sat in the back, with my mother and Beth in the middle, while Mr. and Mrs. Gomez took the seats in the very front of the vehicle. Linda was handed back to Beth by Mrs. Gomez, and Beth was then handed back to me. Because we did not have a baby seat, I had to just hold her in my arms. Nevertheless, I had the sudden realization that there was something off about Linda. The phrase "very solid" comes to mind as the one that captures it the best. You can feel the joints pressing at the elbows when you're holding a cat, a dog, or a baby, and the skin moves over the bones. This is similar to how you feel when you hold a baby. You can get the distinct impression that it is a living creature because it has moving parts. It's possible that when you're holding something living, you won't be aware of this fact. However, what I was holding had none of that, and it stood out. It did not feel like skin was attached to muscle on Linda's arms, and those muscles had the ability to move. They appeared to be solid masses of meat that did not move at all. The sound of the car starting up distracted me from my thoughts at that moment. And I moved in a little bit closer to Linda. "All right, I agree, that was pretty funny." While Jared was starting the car, my mother said. I began to feel concerned as Mrs. Gomez continued to be silent while holding that baby who appeared to have something seriously wrong with them. The fact that it was all so strange gave me the impression that perhaps I was dreaming, which helped me feel less anxious about the situation. Jared immediately began to pull the vehicle out of the parking spot. "Stop it, Jared!" the mother yelled at him. "This isn't funny anymore." I ought to have been concerned about whether or not he could even see or whether or not that was even Mr. Gomez hiding under there. However, all I could think about was the completely incorrect baby that I was holding in my hands. She was completely motionless at that point. I drew her in closer to my body and asked in a hushed voice, "Linda?" After that, I put my hand on her chest and felt neither the gentle rise and fall of her breathing nor the soft beating of her tiny heart. I was puzzled. I continued to press more firmly, but I was unable to feel even the faintest hint of ribs under there. It appeared as though a baby-shaped piece of meat had been cut away from the body of a much larger animal by someone. "Beth." I reached across the aisle and grabbed her shoulder while she was sitting in the seat in front of me. "Linda seems to have some kind of problem," I said. My mother was pleading with Mr. Gomez at this point, saying, "Really, this is dangerous, and this has gone on for far too long. Please, Debbie, explain to him that this is not funny." We were getting ready to pull out onto the road, but all of that seemed very far away to me. "Beth." When I grabbed her shoulder more firmly, I saw a splash of a reddish-brown liquid seep out into the bandages right where her arm connected to her torso. I let go of her shoulder after I saw the liquid. Now Mr. Gomez was going to turn to the left, which would bring us back to the place where they had stopped. Where everything that had happened to them was just sitting around waiting to happen to us as well. "Listen, it's fine. Just driving back." Mr. Gomez said it, and I had a hard time determining whether or not that was how he had sounded previously. He didn't talk much. "We're just driving back, so don't worry, all right?" Mrs. Gomez repeated after me. When Beth heard what was said and finally turned around, the black misshaped gauze in her eyes appeared to be completely opaque. It was a mystery to me how Mr. Gomez was able to see. The voice that emanated from her body was that of a young girl, but it was not quite Beth's voice. "The infant is doing well. I have a hard time believing that she is Beth. I believe that it would be best for us to go to the hospital." Beth's eyes, which were wrapped in black, looked at Linda or whatever else I was holding at the time. "The baby will be used for research in the medical field." What the fuck is going on? I didn't even give it a second thought to cuss in front of my mother, and for some reason, that made the whole situation feel even more serious. "Mom, can you tell me what's going on?" "Don't worry, sweetie, everything is going to be okay," my mother has responded. Then she turned her attention to the dummy that was playing the role of Mrs. Gomez. "Debbie, do you know when my birthday is?" She grabbed her and appeared concerned, and I have no doubt that she felt the same inhuman texture that I had felt underneath those bandages. "Did you forget about my birthday, Debbie?" "It's going to work out just fine, honey." The thing had a response. And as I got a better look at Mrs. Gomez for the first time, I noticed that there was definitely something wrong with the way her head was constructed. It went on for an inordinately long time. It appeared as though she had been drawn out and stretched from the top of her crown to where her chin should have been. But it's possible that the illusion was created because of the way her hair was wrapped around the crown of her head under there. As I continued to examine the rest of her, I came to the conclusion that the wrappings gave the impression that she was not wearing any clothes underneath them. When I glanced over at Beth, I saw that she was noticing the same thing. She always wore oversized hoodies and loose jeans, so her figure should have been much more rounded underneath those clothes. Extremely unsettling to me was the prospect of them removing even more clothing than that in order to play along with this joke. The only part of Mr. Gomez that I could see was the back of his head, and I became conscious of how big it appeared to be. And extremely round, coming very close to being round to perfection. It appeared as though someone had attempted to cover up the fact that they had severed his head and replaced it with a basketball. When I picked at the bandages that were on Linda's face, I was eventually able to peel them up over one of her eyes. Her eyes were blue, just like Linda's were, but her skin had a sickly appearance to it. At that point, I had no doubt that she had passed away. "Mom, what do we do?" As the trees moved closer to the roadway, I asked that question. I had the impression that if we made it to the spot where the Gomez family had stopped, the place where the trees leaned over the road, everything would be over when we got there. "Honey, just relax and take it easy, everything will be all right," my mother commented while she was in the process of unbuckling her seatbelt. I looked down at Linda as I prepared to inform my mother that, well, I thought she might be dead. I thought she had passed away. After that, however, the blue eye blinked. What took place after that is a complete mystery. After that, I don't recall my mother jumping up and attempting to wrestle the steering wheel away from Mr. Gomez, but I know she did. The only thing I remember is waking up after the collision. Beth had a hold of my arm and was yanking me through the forest. Or whoever or whatever was hiding beneath those bandages was the one pulling me along. It appeared as though one of her legs was significantly longer than the other based on the way that she was walking. I blinked my eyes to clear the blood from them and wiped the sweat from my hair off of my forehead. It all came flooding back very quickly. When I turned to look around, I saw that Mr. Gomez was dragging my mom into the woods alongside me, and she appeared to be sleeping. Linda was being held precariously close to the ground by Mrs. Gomez, who hobbled along behind them while carrying her sloppily by one leg. I cocked my head to the side and saw that the car was still smoking while it was wedged against a tree not too far away, and I could still make out the road. I was much more powerful than Beth had been when I fought against the thing that was holding me. It was difficult for me to turn around because she had a firm hold on both of my shoulders. Then I recalled the bloody liquid that had drained from her shoulder earlier. I struggled to get closer to her and ended up standing for a split second. During that time, I punched blindly behind me in the hopes of connecting with the joint. She fell over on her crooked legs, which allowed me to escape her grasp. "Mom!" As I stumbled closer to her, I yelled at her in an effort to wake her up. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. I went for Mr. Gomez's knees and kicked him in the back of one of them, which caused him to fall down. I took hold of Mom and gave her a good shake. The sudden movement caused her eyes to open, and she looked at the object that had been dragging her. She exclaimed, "Oh God," as the events of the most recent few minutes were most likely beginning to come back to her mind. I kicked Mr. Gomez in the knee, and as I did so, I observed a sickly green and brown liquid oozing out of the wound in his knee. "Get a move on." I reached out and grabbed my mother's hand, and together we sprinted toward the road. Either the beasts did not follow or moved at a pace that prevented them from catching up to us. We were able to make it to the highway, and we ran across it. On the shoulder of the road, we ran, waving down passing vehicles while simultaneously attempting to create more space between ourselves and the dangerous objects. Someone came to our aid and whisked us away to the station as quickly as they could. They did not question me, so I am not aware of what my mother disclosed to them. But as far as I am aware, they were never able to locate the Gomez family's vehicle, and the Gomez family has not been seen since. That happened nearly 2 decades ago, and to be honest, I don't give it much thought very often. After a while, I began to wonder if perhaps something else had taken place, and as a kind of trauma response, my brain had decided to make it stranger and more abstract. A few years later, my mother passed away, so I was never able to inquire further about what she recalled. I've never been one to enjoy dwelling on the situation too much. But the reason I'm looking into this again and why I wanted to try to tell someone else about it is because of something that took place only the day before. Over the years, I've been coerced into going on a few camping trips, but it's always been with large groups and always in crowded locations. And I think that helped me start to think even more that I'd imagined what had happened, and that there wasn't anything to be afraid of in the woods. I say this because I think that helped me start to think that I'd imagined what had happened. When taking extended road trips, it was reassuring to know there was nothing ominous waiting off to the side of the road. I was still not fond of the idea of camping, and being in the woods never gave me the feeling that I was in a particularly secure environment, but I had become more accustomed to it. My girlfriend was able to persuade me to accompany her on a camping trip during the winter. She believed that it would be romantic, and the thought of spending the night in a tent with her was too appealing for me to refuse. After all, it was only for one night, and since we both enjoyed the snow, I thought it might be something fun to do together. I reluctantly agreed that we should look for a walk-in site in the forest to the south of where we were. This was in the Midwest, and although a trip to Yellowstone did cross my mind at the prospect of a more secluded trip to the woods, I was thinking that whatever happened that day, it was on the other side of the country because it was in the middle of the country. However, once we exited the highway and turned onto the winding country roads, things began to feel very different. The foothills, with their ever-growing forests, seemed to take on a more ominous air. When we entered the forest, despite the fact that it was the middle of the day and that it is generally accepted that nothing untoward should occur during the middle of the day, I felt an extreme amount of anxiety. After the car that was following us pulled over, we found ourselves suddenly to be the only ones on the road. I was unable to shake the uneasy feeling that something very wrong was going on. Our radio's reception was severely hindered by the hills, and we could hear only static. I reached over to turn it off, but before I could, we heard a voice come through, and it took me a moment to realize that it was the person I was expecting to hear. The voice asked, "Are you worried about having to spend the night in the woods?" And as I was processing what I had just heard, those words brought all of those terrible memories flooding back to me, and I had to slow down the car. The static crackled once more, indicating that it was over, and at that point I turned around. When my girlfriend began to inquire as to what was wrong, I quickly silenced her. After gauging my level of commitment, she gave in. Then, as we approached the boundary of the forest in silence, we overheard someone saying, "Don't go, please don't leave me here." We were getting closer to the beginning of the forest when we once again became aware of her voice. Beth said softly, "I'm still scared of sleeping in the woods. I'm still so scared."